record this. There we go. All right. So our last day is going to be Tuesday, the 11th, and the exam is going to be due on the 13th. So let's be clear. By that Tuesday class, you'll long since have had the material that you need to start working on the question for Othello. So it's not like we're going to be covering vital information that pertains to that question on that day, and that you're going to have to postpone answering that question. Long before, a solid week before, we'll have really addressed some of those questions already. Pertaining to Othello. Okay, so some of the big things on the exam to keep in mind. Number one, just remember you're writing an essay. And what I mean by that is just that you have a form where the question prompts you to make a general claim, which is a kind of thesis statement that's then supported by evidence and logical reasoning on your part, right? So that's what I mean by an essay form. I mean that you've read carefully and that you've tried to structure your answer in a logical and coherent way, that you've proofread, that the passage, the sentences are coherent, not only as standing alone, but coherent in terms of their logical flow, excuse me, from one to the next. You do need to provide some type of introduction, like a sentence or two that's addressing the broad scope of the question, and then you get to the specifics. And there's nothing wrong with providing, maybe 3 sentences of introduction. But one thing I noticed is your introduction needs to be specific to the question rather than just specific to the text. So for example, it's probably out of your mind at this point, but the first part of the question dealing with Genesis was about Eve's motivations. So for example, whatever type of introductory remarks you might make, they should be specific to Eve's motivations and not some general discussion about, oh, Adam and Eve were made in God's image and they were put in a garden and then they picked the fruit and then they suffered this fall. All true facts. Maybe even some keen observations, but the key thing is it has to be directly related to the question. So, I mean, that deals with one issue to keep in mind of scope, which is the question determines what's in your answer, but it also determines what's not in your answer. Anything that's not directly relevant to answering that question shouldn't be in the text, right? The next thing is, and this is part of scope, to stay close to the question, right? It's very easy. And I remember when I was, writing these kinds of exams, I had the same issue, which is that you get ideas and you start to go off topic into other things that may be very interesting, maybe even very insightful. But I really want to see people stay focused on the question that's being asked very specifically. So for example, in a couple instances, I asked you to explain the meaning of certain quotations. And there were some instances where people didn't really even reference the quotation and didn't explain it, right?
Professor,
Yes.
sorry. I think it would be helpful to a lot of people if you could perhaps add comments to the to the grades so we could know what
Well,
justified.
first of all, there's comments on the exam itself.
Oh, you mean like comments on our grades? Because I didn't get any comments with my
No. So if you
grade.
bring up the exam document, there's comments on the document itself.
I see. Okay.
And you should be able to access your document with little it's like PDF style Post-it notes.
I'm looking right now. Hang on. I oh yeah, I see the comments now.
Okay, good.
Awesome.
There might be a certain way you need to access it.
Yeah,
Oh, let me tell you,
you just
I
gotta click
put
on it.
comments. I mean, I spend the time to read every sentence,
Thank
right?
you. Yeah.
Okay. So it's there. And so those are specifically pertaining to each person, but just general comments. I won't kind of get on here. The other thing is not only staying close to the question, but staying close to the text. What does your answer what does this mean? What does this passage mean? The answer is found in the language of the text, in the specificity of the language of the text. You're using that text to support your claim, which means you need to draw on it as directly as possible. It doesn't always mean you need to quote it verbatim in quotation marks, but it does mean you need to reference something very specific in the text instead of some type of more general remark. I mean, one of the challenges of teaching the Bible is many people are believers, and they have their own knowledge from example, their own religious education. So sometimes I find people putting remarks that pertain to their own religious education, which are a certain type of interpretation of the text, which if you read the text closely, uh, you've got to ground that claim specifically in the text, right? Um, and some of those theological questions start to get, distant from some of the specific statements in the text. Then the other, just last two little things. So you needed to cite from all those texts, and you needed to try to do it as much as was appropriate. So, I mean, every time you're giving an answer to one of those sections of the answer, you need to be supporting that with evidence from the text. That's that's the source of your answer, right? It's coming from there, either from a passage in the text or your understanding of a specific passage in the text. So you want to stay close to the text, and one way you need to do that is to cite the text. And one issue was, for example, in the first set of questions dealing with Genesis, I mean, I asked you to draw on all three texts. Didn't mean you had to draw on all of them equally. Certain parts of the question kind of lent themselves more to one than the other, but you needed to draw on all of them. And there were some instances where people didn't sufficiently do that and cite directly. And remember, and I'll make this clear on the exam sheet for the final, but when you cite, you just do a parenthetical notation with the author's name and the page number, but you need to include the page number to clarify exactly where that's coming, that statement is coming from, right? So you don't want to just say, oh, Cass says thus and so. You need to provide that page number, right? That's just kind of proper procedure for writing any type of paper where you're citing a source. And just remember, you shouldn't be using as one or two people in my 4 classes. You shouldn't be citing anything outside the text that I provided, right? Because this is about your thinking based on those class texts, and not thinking that's done for you by other secondary sources that could be found, just about anywhere. Questions about that? Questions about the exam, either the midterm or the final?
Professor, I haven't seen my score on Blackboard though for the exam.
Yeah, so I literally just got them completely done right before class.
Oh, because remember I had an issue, so I emailed you at the exam, so you said I have received the email, so I don't know if you submitted on.
I mean, I think I remember grading your exam. It's all up there. It's just, it went up last minute. Yes? And you should have gotten a response email from me that I received your exam.
Yeah, I did receive a response from you that you received my exam. So, but I don't see any graded on my Blackboard though.
You're looking right now?
Yeah, right now as we speak.
Okay, well, it was graded. So maybe you should just,
Because I have the same issue.
yeah, so I just posted them, and maybe they'll take a moment to register, but they will be there.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, I went through all of them. They're there. Blackboard is glitchy that way. Okay, so Christine's saying refresh it. Okay, so anyway, there shouldn't be any problems. They should be graded. The ones I've received have been graded, and I had every exam from the students who are currently in the class. So that's pretty simple. If you have particular questions, please get in touch one way or the other, and we'll talk about it. Okay, so can we move on here? Do people have other questions? Okay, I try to be thorough so people feel like they're not out to sea and they know what I'm expecting, right? Okay, so on Tuesday, we're going to start looking specifically at a couple really important speeches that really establish what's going on in this play, and particularly they establish the identity of Iago and Othello, right? The two main characters in this play. And interestingly, the play's called Othello, but Iago really is the man who is on stage, you could say on screen, a substantial portion of the time. And in many ways, he's the kind of focal point of the play, which is an interesting element of the fact that ostensibly this play is about Othello and not Iago. But so today we're going to get a lay of the land of this play. We're going to get a little historical context that's relevant, and we'll talk about what's going on in this play, and we'll start to introduce the characters and start to get a feel for them. And these two speeches that we'll look at for next class, that will be the basis for the reading response assignment. They are really going to spell out the nature of these two characters, right? And one dimension of Shakespeare is his really profound concern to probe the psychology and motive of characters. And one thing that's fascinating about these characters is that they're very lifelike in the sense that they have, you could say, loose ends, or they're open. They are not fixed. They are not set in stone. They're in motion psychologically, and they have loose ends, and they have contradictions. They're not completely easily understood. They're not transparent in what's going on in them. And I think that's what real people are like. And there's some interesting kind of historical developments we'll talk about that maybe explains at least partially why Shakespeare was interested in crafting this kind of character of a depth and open-endedness in this way. So one thing that's interesting about this play is we get an initial impression of these characters, and also initial impression of what we think personally about how we judge them, whether we like them, whether we don't. These are all important factors. Seeing characters on stage is no different than seeing people in real life. We observe and we make judgments. We make conclusions based on the evidence we have. And so these two speeches really lay out their basic natures, but we'll see things change and evolve in interesting ways. Or if not, I mean, this is an interesting question. Do these characters really change, or do we just get to see different facets of them being revealed under different circumstances, right? It's a great kind of debate. Not an easy question to answer. So partly what we're going to do is not just use those speeches to get at their natures, but to look at the language of Shakespeare and some of his, there are kind of a handful of central themes. He's got like a tool bag of themes that manifest in the language: issues of appearance and reality, dark and light, good and evil, the kind of different fundamental motivations of each character. And he comes back to this tool bag, or this well, he comes back to it over and over again. And once you start to see that language and understand the basics of what he means by it, you'll start to pick it up throughout the play. So today we're not going to spend so much time looking at the language, but just kind of getting an overview of what this play is all about, and a little discussion of your impression of the characters, depending on how far you've waded into the text at this point. So we'll start out in just a moment talking about the title, and then we'll look at the setting, which is what? What is the setting of this play?
Venice.
Venice, which at the very least, I hope everybody got from the title. But Venice plays a really important role in this play. Venice historically was a very, very important, very powerful city. And Venice really becomes like a character. And there's also a kind of, you might say, a kind of Venetian disposition. Venice is a city. It's very urbane. It's sophisticated. It's cosmopolitan. And most of its inhabitants follow suit. They act in a very cosmopolitan and sophisticated way. And you might say that they even border on a kind of cynicism. They have a kind of savoir-faire. They're very worldly. And we'll see, for example, that characters like Desdemona and Othello, there's a part of their identity that doesn't fit so well in the cosmopolitan world of Venice, because they're kind of more pure, they're kind of more simple, they're kind of characters are kind of untainted in a certain way. And that can be seen as something positive in them, that they have this kind of purity, or it can be as something negative, that they haven't kind of matured enough to know how to kind of massage this reality and get by in it, because they end up being exploited through, I mean, we might just call it their innocence, right? And Venice is not a place, just like New York City, right? It's not a place for the innocent or the exceedingly pure and innocent. So we'll talk about this, and then we'll talk about the characters and just establish the basic conflict or conflicts, and the plot. And of course, we discover in the opening scenes of the play in Act 1 that Iago has his own plot. He talks about his motives for what he's going to do, and he talks about what he's going to do. And what's interesting is there's a plot here has a kind of a pun, right? So a plot can mean, the structure of events that unfold in a story, right? Or a plot can be that thing that conspirators plan out to perpetrate against their victim, right? And here the two kind of go hand in hand, because Iago contrives a plot, this kind of conspiracy with himself, where he leverages people to carry out the plot, but they're not in on the plot. Only he knows what it is. And even the reader or the spectator is given a general idea of what the plot is, but we don't and he talks about that he has this, he calls it a monstrous birth. He's got an idea in his mind. His mind gives birth to an idea that is brought to light through him executing the idea, executing the plot. And so it's only when he actually executes his plot or his conspiracy that we really see exactly in detail what it is, although we get a general idea. Not unlike we know, for example, Odysseus is going to make it home. We know that he's going to succeed, but we don't know the details of how it's going to happen. So we don't know the details of his plot. But there's this interesting harmony between his agenda, you could call it, and the actual plot structure of Othello. And it's almost as if he is the dramatist, or he is the puppet master, actually kind of directing these characters through manipulation, his very cunning manipulations, to get them to do what he wants them to do. Right, it's quite fascinating. So for a moment, I'd just like to look at the title of the play. Where's a good place to start with any book or any drama? You start with the title. Okay, so typically we think of it as Othello, right? But the full title is
Tragedy of
The
Othello.
Tragedy of Othello, comma, the Moor of Venice. The Moor of Venice. So there's really two key elements to the title as I see it. Number one, there's raised the theme of tragedy, and the tragedy is to befall, obviously, Othello. So in a moment, we want to talk about what we think a tragic play is really all about, right? Obviously, the Greeks in the 5th century and 4th century BC, they really developed the genre of tragedy. And for the Greeks, as Aristotle writes in the Poetics, there is a very specific structure and conception of tragedy in ancient Greece. And for the most part, Shakespeare doesn't deviate from the basic spirit of it. It has many commonalities. Although I think he takes the rules of it and plays with them a bit more than maybe the Greeks did. So it's a tragedy. What is a tragedy? Then the second part is, it's very fascinating. um, it's almost like a Homeric epithet, Othello, the Moor of Venice. The second part of this title that's significant is that Othello is identified. He's identified in two ways. On one hand, he's identified by his proper name, his first name, Othello. And on the other hand, which is a specific, particular name that refers to a human individual, this guy Othello. And on the other hand, he's just called the Moor of Venice. So when we get to it, we'll have to talk about exactly what a Moor is, because this is what we see here is two facets of his identity. On one hand, he's identified as a human individual who's distinct with his own particular characteristics, the way every human individual is different and distinct and peculiar. And then he's also identified as this kind of stereotype. He's not identified in his specifics and his own unique character or identity, but he's simply described as a Moor, right? And not just a Moor, but then there's this contrast of a Moor in Venice, a Moor in Venice. And what's interesting is that it's both unusual and not unusual that a Moor would be in Venice. As we've said, Venice was a very cosmopolitan city. It was one of the most powerful city-states in Europe, not just in Italy, during the 16th. The play was written and performed in 1603, and it's set pretty much contemporaneous to the time it was written. And most likely, it doesn't provide total specificity as to the time period, but it's clearly just about contemporary or contemporaneous. And this battle with the Turks, that is the kind of subtext of the conflict that Othello is experiencing. This was raging straight through 1603, but there was a famous, I want to say it's the 1570s, there was a famous Battle of Lepanto, which seems to be being referenced in what happens with them going out to Cyprus to then confront the Turkish navy. The Battle of Lepanto was a famous naval battle. Of course, the irony of Othello going to Cyprus is they end up not fighting any battle, because there's another type of battle that's going to unfold, and it's between him and Iago. It's not on the battlefield, or it's not on the high seas, right? So Venice was a huge military and commercial power, and it all had to do with its navy, which was a major commercial and military force. And because they were engaging, they were the main city-state in the Renaissance period that was a kind of go-between between East and West because of their navy. And here Othello is this character who's he's caught in two worlds. He's a Moor on the one hand, which is a person who comes from North Africa, which isn't necessarily Eastern, but his background would have been Muslim. At least his ancestry would have been Muslim, because of the Arab conquest during the Middle Ages of the Mediterranean basin, right? So Venice being connected in with North Africa, Venice being connected in with the Near East, the Middle East, and the Far East with its shipping, would have been exposed to all different types of people in their commerce and their military engagements. So to have a man like Othello in their midst is not profoundly unusual, right? He's a stranger up to a point, right? As a Xenos, an alien. On the other hand, I mean, this is a society that has exposure to other ways of life, so they're familiar. The other, the other element is that despite the cosmopolitan nature of Venice, he's not a white European, which it seems that this More of Venice title seems to highlight. And of course, today when people talk about this play, the first thing they want to say is it's a play about race. It's a play about race. Um, the color of his skin is absolutely a factor in this play, but it is not the only factor, and it's hardly clear that it is the decisive factor, right? To say that Othello is a Moor, well, why don't we talk about this right now, and then we'll come back to tragedy. To say Othello is a Moor is not like saying he's black, right? A Moor is not simply a racial identity. It is a combined kind of ethnic identity of certain Berber tribes that lived in North Africa. And number two, tribes that had been converted to Islam during the Middle Ages by the Arab conquests that made it all the way to southern Spain, southern Italy, and Sicily, and North Africa, right? The Arabs had created a massive empire all the way to Spain during the Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages, and they were really the most sophisticated society in the European world. Of course, this is a moment where like Europe is in the Dark Ages. And of course, Spain, among other states, because Spain was, predominantly infiltrated by Arab influence, they started what was called the Reconquista, the reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula from the Arab invaders, right? And so this tension between East and West, this tension between the Christian European world and the Muslim Turkish world of the Near East, right? So at this moment, Venice is in a conflict with, and the rest of Europe, in a conflict that lasted till the First World War in various forms, right? Against the Ottoman Turks that were situated, they basically had an empire that was centered around Istanbul and modern day Turkey, but really extended well into the Middle East at that time, because they were the dominant force in the Middle East. And for hundreds of years, there was this ongoing tension between and open military conflict between the two. And you can see then how like Othello's identity is a kind of a hybrid of these two worlds, and that he is a kind of microcosm of this conflict between the Europeans and the Muslim Turks that is the subtext in which this story happens, even though it doesn't seem to be quite the focus. And this really actually comes to the fore not until the very end of the play, where Othello makes some very interesting remarks about his own identity, which we need to talk about more in a minute. But just notice here, we can already see a conflict with Othello in his identity. On one hand, he's an Othello, the individual, and the Venetians will treat him as such, as an individual, and not as a representative of like some identity group. Then there are other moments in which he's not really recognized for his own individual accomplishment, his own identity, his own merit, and he's understood simply as the Moor. So one thing as you read, it's really interesting and important to track in when characters speak to Othello. Do they call him Othello, or do they call him just the Moor? And you'll notice at decisive moments, they'll use one or the other. And it seems that this starts to tie in with the title, because the title is highlighting this kind of split identity of Othello, which is really quite fascinating. Tragedy. It's a form of drama, right? What do you associate? So I'm not asking you, give me the technical definition of a tragedy. I'm asking more broadly, what do you associate with a play that's called a tragedy? What would you expect to find?
Like a bad ending.
Like a suffering, great suffering.
Perfect. So
Romeo and Juliet would be more aptly named the tragedy of Romeo and Juliet.
yeah, and of course it is a tragedy, and it not necessarily necessary to use that name for it to be categorized as a tragedy, right? So number one, you think of suffering of some kind, and you think of a bad ending. So that's a really good start. I mean, coming from the Greeks, one of the things they seem to want to emphasize, and we already see it in the Odyssey, but the interesting thing about the Odyssey is it does not obviously have a negative ending. It has a kind of happily ever all type ending. And yet one of the focuses of the Odyssey, as we've talked about with that scar being a kind of emblem, it's an emblem of Odysseus's suffering, right? So the Greek literature and ancient literature in general, we've seen it in the Bible with things like Job and even the Fall, an emphasis on the intrinsic suffering involved in the human condition, or the suffering that is the product of the flaws of human nature, the imperfections of both human nature and the imperfections of human life. This word tragedy seems to be an acknowledgement of that, and particularly a vision of the world that doesn't believe that there's some kind of magical scientific silver bullet of progress, or moral a magic bullet of moral progress that's going to lead us to utopia. And I mean, one way you can think about utopia is like the ultimate historical liberation from the tragic element of life. And when you talk about the tragic element of life, you just talk about those inextricable realities of life that incur suffering that can't be magically removed, and that therefore we have to cope with, acknowledge, and in some way accept, or even be resigned to. And of course, our modern disposition is like, we don't want to be resigned to any type of suffering, because we expect that we're all going to get liberated either by the politicians or by science from it. A bad ending. So interestingly, comedy almost, and particularly Shakespeare's comedies, always have a happy ending. They may involve some turmoil, they may involve real conflict, but they always have a kind of magical way of being resolved happily by the end of the tale. So it's true, every tragedy ends poorly, and particularly it ends poorly for the main character. Is this play just the tragedy of Othello, though? I mean, he is the focal point. Who else suffers a tragedy?
Desdemona.
Yeah, certainly Desdemona. And in fact, I mean, she is the kind of almost complete innocent, almost like a kind of sacrificial victim in all this. Othello, we can start, and we'll talk about this in a moment, but I mean, Othello, as we wade more into the play, we can see that, yes, Iago has deceived him. Yes, Iago has taken advantage of him. And yes, Iago is rather diabolical and responsible for Othello's downfall. But the more we wade into the play, the more we start scratching our heads saying, now, wait a second, Othello maybe should know better. Or wait a second, Othello should have more faith in his wife. Or wait a second, Othello should consult with his wife and not just accept at face value what Iago is saying to him. So we start to become aware of Othello's culpability, which by contrast, it's just very hard, other than her being innocent and maybe too innocent for her own good. It's really hard to find any specific fault with Desdemona. And she is really the kind of ultimate tragic victim in this play. Anyone else is a kind of victim of the tragedy? Yeah, so poor Rodrigo dies, right? We'll come back to, I mean, he's a little less significant, but absolutely Emilia dies. Neither of these people quite deserve their fate. And let's just say lots of people die and are suffering at the end. And of course, Othello kills himself, right? So everybody's dead at the end. At least a lot of the key players are dead. Anything else you associate with tragedy? Things that come into your mind that seem to be,
Like someone dying.
yeah, absolutely, right? I mean, it's not always the case that people die, but it's very common.
Hmm.
Someone who was attacked by acid.
I'm sorry, what did you say?
Someone who was attacked with acid. Acid throwing.
I can't completely clear. I can't hear you totally.
Like acid attack.
Accidental.
No. Let me write it down.
Okay. What do you mean? What does that have to do with Othello?
Oh no, I thought like we can use any example. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I don't expect you to know the formal definition of a tragedy, but I'm just kind of imagining what kind of associations you have within the context, at least of drama, within the literary form, right? I mean, acid attack, I think what you're saying is something that's kind of gratuitously done to someone else that doesn't seem to be with full justification. So if we think about what Iago does to Othello, it doesn't seem like there's any real justification. And it's I mean, I think the important word is gratuitous. I mean, gratuitous kind of means like freely done. It implies like you've done something without any justification, and that actually makes it even more horrific what you've done, because it's not within the bounds of even close to what's appropriate, or there can't, there's not even like a scintilla of reasonableness to what's being done to the person. So Daniel says a decline in character from good to bad, right? So one of the classic elements of tragedy is, number one, that the protagonist is a larger, this is important, a larger than life figure, superior to us, which is to say superior to the viewer, right? And that they have a fatal flaw, of their character, right? And the fatal flaw is like a crack in the glass, or like a crack in the wall, that you talk about the decline of the character. I mean, it's a question of whether they really decline, or whether that crack in their character starts to get exposed to external forces, and then it becomes no longer a crack and it kind of explodes and breaks down, right? So as Angel said, a fatal flaw that leads to what? To their downfall, right? And so this issue of downfall is important, because it's a downfall relative to the high status. They start out up here above us, and what happens through their fatal flaw, and their fatal flaw being exploited by circumstance, they suffer a downfall, and they're brought down from this extraordinary level down to our own level, or even you could say below our own level. And I mean, one concept of tragedy was that it was designed for the audience to see that even superior people are still mere mortals, and they shouldn't be treated anything other. I mean, think about today, the way we laud all these dumb celebrities, and we put them up on a pedestal. And I mean, you know, I'm sure none of you guys do that, but I mean, there's still a huge segment in our society that like thinks there's something special that these people are providing their lives. I mean, some of the music's good, but just because their music's good doesn't make them genuine heroes or have great character or be models to emulate, God forbid. So we're reminded that even the most excellent, right? Remember the word virtue means human excellence. Uh, even the most excellent people are still mere mortals. And it provides us a kind of perspective, both on the superior people in our society, but also on what human beings are in general. That again, this kind of tragic element of resignation to the imperfections of human nature. So they suffer a downfall, right? Good. And well, let's ask this right now. If some character flaw leads to their downfall, uh, what is so if we're talking about a character flaw with Othello, it means clearly that Iago is not completely culpable for Othello's downfall, right? Um, what are Othello's what are the flaws in his character?
He thrives on his self-image of himself.
Okay, good. He is a general. He is, and these soldiers like Cassio and Iago, they're all soldiers, and they're all concerned for their honor. And this is a really old-fashioned model of the soldier. It's still true today, but it's a kind of classic image that the soldier is concerned with their status in the order of rank of society and the military, and they want to be recognized for their worth, and therefore their own self-image is really dependent on the way other people look at them and the way other people honor them. And of course, the big challenge with Othello, could you say that again? How did you say it? So Angel says he has insecurities about his identity. I think that's very well put. Who just made the last remark about these kind of insecurities?
Oh, me or somebody else in the chat?
Was it what? Brittany, what exactly did you say again?
Oh, I said that he has insecurities about, like, no, he really is, like, he depends on his self-image a lot, so he thrives on it.
Well, we should say to say he depends on his self-image. Let me just clarify. You mean that his self-image is partly dependent on how other people see him?
Correct.
Okay, because that's key. Because there could be another person who draws their resources internally, and they distance themselves from how other people see them, and they have a kind of inner security and inner faith. Yeah, so he's insecure, and it seems obvious that his insecurities, number one, they stem maybe from some just native element of his human nature, but also it's obviously amplified, these insecurities, by being a Moor in Venetian society. And this, of course, gets complex because we'll, in a moment, we'll have to talk about his exact relationship with Venetian culture and Venetian society, because it's more complex. He's an outsider, but he's not an outsider. He's an outsider and an insider. But I mean, there's a great. Well, I'll come to that in a little bit. But I mean, here's where the color of his skin becomes relevant. He can't make the color of his skin go away. And whatever his character is, whatever his principles are, however similar they may be to the Europeans he's around, he's still different on the outside, even if he's not really different on the inside. And therefore he gets, at least with certain characters, and it's something he becomes aware of, he's distant. And let's be clear, Iago says, when he's speaking about Othello behind his back, he just calls him the Moor. He doesn't call him Othello. He calls him the Moor. So, I mean, Iago throws around this stereotype of a man who doesn't completely belong in their society. And because of that, it's a pejorative statement, right? It's has a negative connotation. Okay, so we were asking the question, what are Othello's flaws? and definitely insecurities bred about his identity. That's really crucial. Does anyone want to say anything else about what his weaknesses or his vulnerabilities are? I think I could think of a couple more that are actually related to the insecurity, or at least they work in concert with his insecurities.
Desdemona.
Jealousy.
Okay, he's jealous. All right, so this is really crucial. And I think we're going to discover that his insecurities about his own identity in this society and his jealousy are actually going to be, they're hard to completely disentangle. So let's just say what provokes his jealousy. Let's just explain that.
Him thinking that his wife is cheating on him.
Okay, good. So let's just nail down what jealousy is, right? It's he believes that another man is sleeping with his wife, therefore he's bitter. He feels slighted because he believes that someone else is sleeping with his wife, right? And I mean, let's ask this: Does Othello love his wife? Does he truly love his wife? I mean, yeah, I'll leave it at that for a moment. Does he truly love his wife? What was your reaction?
Oh, are you asking or just like rhetorical?
No. Oh, I'm absolutely asking.
Oh, so for me, I thought it was more he only liked her because of how she perceived him, like hearing like stories about him being a soldier and stuff. She was like, "Oh wow, this is great." So he's like, "Okay."
Well, I mean, I'd probably like someone who perceived me nicely, because not everybody perceives me nicely, and they probably don't perceive there's probably a lot of people that they don't perceive nicely. Yeah, I mean, that is the way the love affair is portrayed. I mean, actually, I think, to Othello's credit, partly her perception of him, she actually seems to understand him. I mean, she doesn't understand all the war and the battle and the suffering he's gone through, but she's able to, I guess, empathize with it and kind of feel his suffering that he's gone through. And he appreciates that. Right. And I think that's a pretty innocent motive for a relationship. He loved the idea of her loving him. Angel can't speak out loud. It could be. So I'll ask it again. Other people, does he really love his wife?
I think he does because like he's actually worried about like her cheating on him. Like I feel like if he didn't love her to like some extent, he wouldn't really care about that.
Actually, I think what I'm getting at is that I'm not sure I agree with that. Right? At the real extreme, look, I don't think anybody's going to be happy being cheated on. Right? But if your real priority is to love the person, you're going to love them first rather than feel jealousy. Because I think the issue we're getting at now is the distinction between loving someone and feeling jealous about what they may or may not have done. And I don't think those two things are the same.
Yeah, you're right.
And this actually gets at the problem of Othello's love for his wife. What other, if you could come up with the worst motive for him to marry her and to want to be married to her, what would it be? Let's assume the worst of Othello. What's
money?
part?
Raise his dad.
Okay, it could be money. I'm not sure that's really ever insinuated, though. There are some other things that I think are potentials as to why he married her.
Is it because everybody sees her as the fairest? Or like she's like
Okay,
a trophy?
so there's all this language of light and dark and fair and dark and so on and so forth. She's fair skinned, she's blonde, and he's dark in complexion, and he gets to be with her, the woman who has the complexion that's prized in this society, right? Um, and therefore it's a kind of like a feather in his cap, right? And if it is a feather in his cap, then you can see precisely why he's jealous of her. See, that's what it is. When you love someone, it's about being concerned for them. When you're jealous of them, you are possessive of them, and you're not treating them as an object of love. You're treating them as an object that you want to control and to possess and to have exclusively as yours. Now, the boundary between love and jealousy are not absolute, because I think most people would say, well, if I'm really in love with them and I'm committed to them, they also should be mine in a certain way, but not in an absolute way, right? So this gets dicey and kind of separating these issues. But I think there's definitely something, as someone who's insecure in this society for these reasons, over his identity, that she kind of is his passport to complete belonging, or to an extension of his belonging. Look, he's not a complete foreigner in this society. We are going to have to talk about the extent to which he's assimilated into this world, because he is very assimilated, which it's easy to lose sight of that, just how assimilated he is. But he's aware of being different, for obvious reasons. And she seems to be like a kind of confirmation that he's a Venetian. He's one of them. And therefore, the threat of someone sleeping with his life is the threat of losing that confirmation of his own status and his own identity. Becomes a threat not just to his relationship, but to his own being recognized in a certain way in the society. So he feels jealousy, and this is important because we would distinguish jealousy from love, right? That's really crucial. What did I want to ask? Why are they a real couple? I mean, is everybody really that cynical? Maybe you didn't read carefully. I think when you read those opening passages of his speech, where he defends himself in the Doge's palace to Desdemona's father, and Desdemona, the Doge, and all the other signoria, the senators who are there. I mean, it's quite heartfelt. And he comes across as a very honorable man. He's an honorable soldier. What position does he have as a soldier? Is he like a little? Yeah, so he's not some infantryman who's like a pawn in the game of war who's going to get off the next time they go and fight. He's a general. He's not just any general. He seems to be leading all the Venetian forces, and he is the one specially chosen for this very important battle that they end up not fighting against the Turks at Cyprus, right? I mean, that's crucial. What does he have in common with Desdemona that might further the notion that they have a real love relationship? Let me put it this way. In this world of the Venetians, it's rather Machiavellian, right? Machiavelli famously said, in a bad world, people have to learn how to be bad. Or he said it this way: in a world that's not good, people have to learn how to be not good if they want to get by, right? And so Machiavelli published his famous treatise called The Prince around 1518, I want to say, and it had a profound influence in Europe in general, but particularly in England of all places, because the English were very in tune with Italian literature, and it sparked this Elizabethan age that Shakespeare was part of. So Machiavelli has a vision of a world in which everybody is self-interested, and everyone is kind of, they're looking out for number one, and they're willing to screw everybody over to get what they want. And if they can get away with it, they're going to do it, right? So he says, in a world of people who are not good, the good person comes to their ruin by not learning how to be bad, right? Does that make sense? If you're in a world of crooks and you're innocent, what's going to happen to you?
Die, or I
You're
mean, you'll
gonna
be either
die or
corrupted or
become like them.
Yeah, you're going to get robbed. Oh, you're going to become corrupted. What is Machiavelli saying? If you're going to live in a world of crooks, you better learn how to be a crook. If you're in a world of cons, you better learn how to be a con, at least when it's necessary, because you're not going to survive. And the survival could mean metaphorical or literal, right? So he says you have to learn how to be sneaky and cynical, and so one of the things that both of these characters have in common is a really intense type of innocence. Now, it's interesting to say to call Othello innocent because he's a man who's been on a battlefield. He's a man very much like Odysseus in his speech defending himself. He talks about the stories that he told Desdemona. He talks about traveling around the world and seeing all these unusual sights that are very much like what Odysseus talks about. You know, at least Homer talks about Odysseus. Many of men cities he saw and learned their minds. Othello, in one sense, has seen things that the average person hasn't. And in the sense of what he's experienced in war, he's very sophisticated and he's very experienced. But when it comes to a world that's off the battlefield, when you're in not the battlefield with guns and ammo, but in the battlefield of society and manners and deception, of Venetian culture, he's rather innocent, and he doesn't really have his sea legs. He's frank and he's forthright and he's honest with people, and he expects other people to be the same to him. And of course, when Iago comes to him, his good friend, honest Iago, right? You notice how, if you've gotten through this play, all the characters who depend on Iago and who he exploits, they all call him good friend Iago. Oh, honest Iago, right? And of course, he's anything but. And Othello seems to think he has a mirror image of himself in Iago, because Iago presents this image of, I am your friend. I'm here to support you. I'm here to help you and to give you good advice. And of course, he's exploiting him all along. And all these characters don't realize the way they've been exploited until the end of the play. What's the connection between Othello and Desdemona? They're both very innocent in certain ways, right? They're honest, direct, straightforward people of good character, right? And so this is one of the interesting complications of the Othello character, is that he's a very righteous man. He's an honorable man. And on the other hand, he does seek honor a little excessively, and he has this issue with his with jealousy that seems to stem from his insecurities about his identity, right? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about who Othello is a little bit more. So a Moor is someone from these Berber tribes in North Africa, like modern day Morocco. And they were converted to Islam by the Arabs during the Middle Ages. We talked about all that. So to say someone's a Moor, it refers, one, partially to the color of their skin, a kind of light-skinned dark person, not like black, but a kind of sandy, dark color, like people you would see in Morocco today, number one. Number two, it refers to a geographic region from which they came. Number three, it refers to an ethnicity, a kind of tribal group that existed in Morocco, right? And also a religion, which is to say they were converted at some point to Islam. how would you characterize Othello's identity? Is he incredibly different from the other Venetians in terms of these broad issues of his identity and his origins?
I feel like no. I feel like, but his skin color kind of makes it, everybody kind of sees him like that, even though he's not really that different.
Well, it's not consistent how they see him. In different moments, they see him differently, right? In different circumstances, they see him differently. I guess what I'm asking here is how assimilated is he? This is really crucial. And it gets us beyond this simplistic notion that the play is just about race and everything that plays out today in America is, it's all just the same stuff. No doubt there's some commonalities that just cannot be avoided, but it's not everything. And that's important to see. So the question is, how assimilated or integrated is he into Venetian culture? And how would we know that?
Well, he's very assimilated. Well, he's a general. That's one, so he probably knows
Yeah. He probably knows what?
their, how would you say, customs, how to act around in Venice.
Sure. I mean, first of all, we can just make the observation that if he was a complete alien, a complete foreigner, foreign to the ways of Venice, there is no way he ever would have become general of the army and been given such confidence by the leader, the Doge of the Venetian Republic, and also the senators, including Brabantio, who's Desdemona's father, right? Number one, he wouldn't know the customs. He wouldn't be integrated. People wouldn't respect him. He wouldn't know the score. He wouldn't know what's going on. And of course, you would never give a genuine foreigner such a position of power because, I mean, they may exploit it to your own detriment because their loyalties don't really lie with the Venetian Republic, for example. I mean, do his loyalties lie with the Venetian Republic? Do his loyalties lie with the Venetian Republic? Is he a dutiful soldier?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And he's got a track record because he talks about fighting battles, and we assume that these battles are fought on behalf of the Venetians. He's proven himself, right? I mean, he has risked his life for Venice. And also we could say what it stands for. And Venice was famously a republic, and a republic is at least a type of democracy. It's run by a senatorial elite, but they serve in the interest of all the people, and they have a responsibility to them. And the citizens who live in a republic expect that they're going to be treated in such that their representatives, in not that they're elected because they're hereditary, the senators. They expect that the elite families who have the political power are going to serve the interests of the citizens and serve the state at large rather than just lining their own pockets. And for example, Florence and Venice, when they were republics, I mean, they had a great sense of patriotism. The citizens had a great sense of patriotism because of that special type of very unusual political system that was designed to, benefit all the citizens and not simply be a kind of more dictatorial style. Like, for example, monarchy was obviously at this stage the dominant form of political regime throughout Europe and England and France and Germany and Spain and so on. And Italy had all these city states. So he's obviously, he seems pretty seriously assimilated if he's a general in this military who is respected by everyone and highly respected. Why is he highly respected as a general? Any thoughts about why?
He's very intelligent, and when it comes to like the military matters, he's like, you just see his confidence.
Yeah, so I think one of the things you start to see with Othello is there an issue of like multiple intelligences. He's got an intelligence and a wisdom on the battlefield. He's judicious. He has the right temperament for the battlefield. The problem is, I think we discover that he does not have the right temperament to handle the nuances of Venetian society. It's a different ball of wax. He's a Venetian, but I mean, and actually this actually may have nothing to do with the fact that he's a Moor. It may have nothing to do with his lineage. It may simply have to do with his own personality, and that's the rub with some of his differences with Venice. It may turn out that the key differences he has compared to the other Venetian citizens have nothing to do with the fact that he's a Moor. It could just be his own natural disposition that's the problem.
Yeah, he's like socially, not awkward, but like socially not confident.
Yeah, and he's spent his time in the military, and Shakespeare portrays him in these moments where he's not dealing with military things. He's kind of like a fish out of water.
Yeah.
I mean, the speech that he gives of talking about Desdemona listening to his battles, it seems like he spent a good bit of his adult life in the military and not living ordinary civilian life, right? Is he a Muslim? Actually, that should be an easy answer. What's his religion?
Well, he's not. Wasn't he previously? Isn't he now Catholic because he is where he is? Maybe his prior religion was Islam.
Yeah, so you answered it well. So here's the interesting thing. I think if you're paying attention, he gets this handkerchief from his mother. And when he tells the story to acquit himself of why he's married Desdemona and that he's done it with good intentions, another element of him loving Desdemona genuinely is that he seems to have married her for the right intentions, and he acquits himself. This scene where Brabantio calls him out as basically stealing his daughter, he is ready for that challenge. But it is interesting that they eloped in the first place. I mean, he's the general. You wonder why he didn't feel more comfortable being upfront and forward about this relationship. And it seems to suggest a certain insecurity on his part that people weren't going to accept his relationship with, let's put it this way, Brabantio, the senator's daughter, right? We'll come back to this issue of his religion in just a second, but there's some key juicy points here. Did Othello know? First of all, how did Othello meet Desdemona? What was the context? And I'm not asking you to like describe the first meeting. Just generally speaking, how did he meet her? What were the circumstances that allowed them to meet each
He
other?
was at her father's senator's house, and then he was talking to his father and like telling his stories, and then she overheard it, and that's how it started.
Exactly. And notice what she was seduced by. I mean, we'll see this. She was seduced by his stories and his words, right? Obviously, there's this kind of sexual stereotype of like the virile, colored man or black man who's perceived as a threat to the white man, and so on and so forth. And of course, he's accused of seducing her in nefarious ways just for sex and using like black magic. They have this stereotype of this, and we'll talk of where that comes from, because that's not even about Islam. Like obviously, biblical religions don't truck in black magic. But they have some very kind of stereotyped explanations for why she's interested in him, and that basically he's taken advantage of her, and he's used they describe it as like conjurations, right? A kind of magic. So he knows, before he ever met Desdemona, he knows Brabantio because, well, he's the general of the Venetian Republic, and Brabantio is an esteemed senator. And there's only so many, I think there's like 13 senators. I mean, there's a basic historical basis for the political structure that's depicted here. He doesn't go in great depth with it, but it's enough. And so, of course, they would have been at least familiar with each other. And Brabantio used to spend time with Othello, and because Brabantio enjoyed hearing his war stories, right? And what did Brabantio think about Othello when he heard his war stories? Good, bad, or indifferent?
That he's like animalistic.
No, that's when he discovers that they're married.
Oh, okay. I see what you're saying. Gotcha.
Yep. And then you can get a little insight into Brabantio's psyche and also Venetian psyche generally, as depicted in the play.
So could you say that he thought that it was good because it was good for war, but now that he's associated with his daughter, it was bad because of the nature, like how he assumed?
Yeah. So let's get it clear. When Brabantio hears these stories of Othello talk about war, he's admiring, right? I mean, Othello is like the athletic superstar, talking about all the victories, and Brabantio is a kind of fan, really enjoying it and respecting him for the virtues that Othello displays in battle, and also just for the unusual experiences. And they are friends with one another, right? We have to understand a little bit here that when Othello elopes with Desdemona, there's already, and then Brabantio accuses Othello of taking advantage of his daughter. We have to become aware that there's an already established relationship that's positive between Othello and Brabantio prior to the elopement and their clandestine marriage, right? It's only when, so notice when he's the context of the storytelling with Brabantio, he's Othello. But the moment that Brabantio finds out that his Othello has married his daughter, he ceases to be Othello. And what does he call him? What does Brabantio call him? Not Othello, but what? It's in the title.
More.
Yeah, he calls him the Moor, right? And when he accuses him of taking advantage of his daughter, he doesn't call him Othello, which is what he had called him, and he respected him. He now calls him the Moor. So you see the limits of the French. So this gets more complicated than a kind of simple story of racism, although that's obviously there. It's an element. So when it was just a senator and a general talking war stories, it was very easy for him to be good friends with Othello. But the moment he marries his daughter, it seems to be the case that he's crossed the line. He's gone too far in what the Venetian senator is willing to accept. So you can talk to me about your war stories as a Moor, but you can't take my daughter. You can't take the hand of my daughter. And of course, we're living in a world in which fathers give away their daughters in marriage, and that the father has a final say. I mean, that's just the custom of the age that is very common. So he needs the consent of Brabantio here, ultimately. So we get back to Othello's identity in terms of he's obviously a Christian. He's obviously a devout Christian. And one of the questions is, how does this Moor come to be so assimilated and be a Christian? And I mean, there's no doubt that this man is a Christian. He's succeeded in society. Everyone recognizes that he understands the customs and respects them and appreciates them. But when he talks about his mother and some of her attitudes and beliefs. Like, for example, you know, his mother seems to be some kind of like, I don't want to say she's a witch or a sorcerer, but she's clearly involved in some kind of black magic, or what we might call like a kind of like obviously it's not Creole society or culture, but it's like Creole voodoo type superstitions, and which aren't, I mean, this obviously is not even Islam either. But I mean, so one thing that happens when particularly Christianity and Islam made their way around the world over the course of a couple thousand years, is that when indigenous societies embraced Christianity, what they did is mix their native belief systems and rituals with Christianity or with Islam. So they created really a hybrid, right? That's a mixture of the two. So his mother has these kind of you could call like nativist beliefs about kind of black magic, and this handkerchief is supposed to have it's kind of like magically empowered. And the interesting thing that we don't know is the details in between his mother's generation and his own, right? We're never really told how he came to occupy the position he occupies, or how he split off from his mother's belief system to embrace the belief system of Venice. Although there's one possible explanation, which is that, I mean, one of the interesting features of the Renaissance is that it was a world that was increasingly dynamic in terms of people moving in this, you could say, the socioeconomic structure, and that it was no longer as fixed as during the Renaissance, during the medieval period. So for example, in the world of Homer, which is obviously, much prior to the Renaissance, but there's really no social mobility there. You're born a noble, you're a noble. You're born a serf, you're a serf. You're born in the middle, you're in the middle. And there's no thought of social mobility. Well, the Renaissance is really the moment in Western history in which not only does the idea of social mobility become a very crucial one, that people should rise not based on what they're born into, but what their merit is, what their worth is. And of course, this is important for Iago. Iago says, I have this status, but I'm really the superior man, and I want my superiority reflected. I want the world to recognize. So he has the same issue, some of the same issues. He has his own insecurities about his identity, because he thinks he's better than everyone, but the world isn't seeing it. The world isn't recognizing it. And this plot that he perpetuates is part of his determination for the world to see what he, what he is. So this is a world of social mobility in theory and in practice, right? And the idea that society should be based on merit rather than birth is one that really emerges out of the Renaissance. Clearly doesn't completely happen in the Renaissance until like the revolutions of the 18th century, but the seeds get laid there. And the idea of like the self-made man, the person who, whatever status they started in, raises based on their own efforts. So one idea might be here that, so in this world, one of the ways that you could elevate yourself and have social mobility was actually to go into the military and work your way through the ranks, a place where meritocracy applies. What's meritocracy? Like, you rise based on your efforts and your skill level rather than who you know, at least in general terms. And so, I mean, one of the interesting sociological themes of the Renaissance is, the issue of primogeniture. Which is to say, the firstborn, the first male born inherits all the wealth of the family and the father. So you could actually come from a wealthy family, but if you were the second son, you were screwed, and you had to find other ways of making money for yourself because you didn't get that money. And what those people had to do was Some of them became soldiers. Some of them became professionals. They went out and became lawyers and got educations and things like that. Because if you inherit everything, you're not going to school because you're taking care of you're tending the inheritance and so on. So maybe Othello has kind of assimilated through his process of being in the military, but we don't really know the details of how he ended up there or the relationship between he and his mother. But we know he's pretty assimilated, and that's really crucial because when we talk about him being a Moor, I mean, in many ways, he's really a European in terms of his value system. And the way we know that is the things he says and the things he does, and also the way he's recognized by the other characters in the play, right? Nobody disputes his virtue and his valor. Um, yeah, why don't we just talk about a couple other characters very briefly, and we'll call it quits for the evening. So let me go down to just get the list here. So Othello's a general. We've talked about him. Who's Iago? Who's Iago? What's he all about? What's his position?
He wasn't. No, that was Cassie. I was gonna say lieutenant, but no.
Okay, so we can touch on Cassio. Cassio at the outs, and this is the thing that sets the conflict in motion, that Othello has chosen Cassio to be his lieutenant. And don't expect me to explain all the nuances of these military ranks. But the one thing that the play makes clear and that is important to know is that the lieutenant is something like the second in command, right below the general. He's a kind of the right-hand man of Othello. And Iago does not believe that Cassio deserves this position. He doesn't think he has the merit. He doesn't think he's a good soldier, and he doesn't think he's earned it, to talk about this issue of ranking in society and this issue of merit. However, there's an interesting little catch, and I don't know if you picked up on it because it's fairly subtle, but Cassio was a very important go-between while Othello and Desdemona were carrying on their courtship, and they had to do their courtship in a kind of clandestine way. They couldn't do it publicly because of the issues of his identity. And also, she's not just anybody. She is the daughter of a senator, right? They've got appearances to deal with here. And so the important thing is Cassio helped facilitate Othello's courtship of Desdemona. And not only did he do that successfully, but for example, he didn't take advantage of the intimacy he had with Desdemona. If he were a scoundrel, maybe he would have just taken advantage of Desdemona, right? So one of the big things here is Othello has trust and faith, and there's a clear loyalty of Cassio to Othello, which even if he's not the ideal soldier, might explain why he is actually a good fit and warrants this having the number 2 position, because he can trust Cassio. And that's, you can just see why with a position of power like this, why that would be important. And Cassio is generally presented as, if an imperfect man, as a decent man, obviously compared to Iago. What position does Iago, let's just finish with this little discussion very briefly of Iago. What position does he have in the military?
It slipped my mind. I do know that he's below.
Yeah, so the word that's used is number 1, he's an ensign,
Okay.
which, I mean, it doesn't, I think the word has different meanings in different moments in history and maybe different military structures, but I've always understood an ensign as a pretty low rank. And Iago is 28, So he's not young and he's not old. I mean, Othello is something like early middle age. He seems to be around in his 40s. So, I mean, one of the dynamics between Desdemona and Othello is also age. She is basically a teenager who's incredibly innocent and has no experience with men. She's a virgin. But actually, Othello doesn't seem to have much experience with women. And I think the logic is just that he spent his life being a warrior, and he's innocent. Yes. So Daniel says flag bearer. He's also described as an ancient. And one of the things in all militaries is when you marched your troops, you had someone holding a flag, your colors, to identify which army you were. And probably you've at some point you've probably seen this in like the Civil War, where the job of some of the soldiers as they're marching in battle with bullets flying by their heads and cannonballs flying by their heads is not to shoot a gun, but to carry the colors, right? And of course, you know, you risk life and limb because you're not defending yourself. You're marching the colors. So it's clearly not as prestigious as a position. And I mean, what did Iago think? He thinks that he deserved the promotion more than Cassio, and he's bitter about it because he thinks very highly of himself. He feels like he's more accomplished than Cassio, and he feels like he's just more intelligent and he's more capable than Cassio. And he has some off-color remarks about how he thinks Cassio got this position, which we don't really know are true or false. What else apart from his position in the military? What else can we say about Iago before we go here?
He's not who he says he is.
Okay, so one of the great themes of this play, and very often when I teach this play, we look at Plato's Allegory of the Cave, where all the world is an appearance and the appearance is deceptive. So Iago spends the entire play until the very end presenting appearances of who he wants them to believe he is to every character in the play, except for the audience. And one of the great things about the version of the play that I've recommended or have you watch is that Kenneth Branagh, who plays Iago, does these wonderful asides. And an aside is where the character turns to the audience in character, and instead of speaking to himself or instead of speaking to other characters, actually is speaking to us. And it's understood that he's kind of breaking that fourth plane and that he's in dialogue with us. And it's only when Iago is in dialogue with us that he reveals who he really is. And of course, I think that's even problematic to say that he reveals who he really is, because we never really know for sure. We never know when he's being truthful or not, right? And of course, this appearance that he crafts with other characters is always captured in the fact that they call him a good friend and they call him honest. And if you look into the meaning, this is just finish up a minute or two longer. The word honest, one of its original meanings is not just truthful, but someone who looks like a loyal and decent person, and that their appearance is the same as their reality. So there's a tremendous irony when they call him Honest Iago, someone who appears to be not just truthful, but someone who appears to be righteous, because of course he only appears that way, and in fact he's quite deceptive. So that's really good that you picked up on that, and that becomes the strategy by which he manipulates every character, which is to say he presents them a facade. And let's be honest, he's an actor in the sense that he's able to contrive and conjure up all this behavior with other characters that's completely fabricated and false, right? He's expert at it. What else before we go here can we say about Iago? What else do you notice? What else strikes your mind? Okay, good. He's consumed for contempt with Othello, and he's highly manipulative. He is Iago intelligent or is he stupid?
He's very smart.
Yeah, he's very smart, and he's clearly the most intelligent character in the play. And one of the disturbing realities of this play is that the most intelligent person also turns out to be the most diabolical, right? That's rather unsettling, right? And so as part of his, I mean, not only is he intelligent, but he's obviously very aware that he feels to be himself to be more intelligent than the other characters, and therefore he has no problem manipulating them. And one of the other disturbing elements of this play is not only is he intelligent in a kind of logical way, but he understands the other characters almost like better than they understand themselves. He can see things about their vulnerabilities and their, their weaknesses, what they desire, and he exploits. He presents them exactly what they want to hear, not by accident, but because he has this keen understanding of other people, right? Yeah, aware of his surroundings, manipulates, takes advantage. Yeah, very good. And so let's just ask this. So he displays in the opening speeches he gives this great contempt for Othello. What is it? He says, I hate the Moor, right? Contempt is a great word. And I think that accurately characterizes what he feels. The question is, why exactly does he feel this contempt? And it's interesting because he doesn't give one reason, he gives many in different places throughout the play. And it makes it rather complicated to figure out exactly what his motive is. Why does he have so much contempt for Othello?
He said he wasn't worthy of this position.
Yeah, Othello is a general, he's a commander. Who does Iago think is the real commander?
Himself.
Yes, he sees himself as the person who's worthy of command and the highest position. Lauren, you want to say something?
Yeah, sorry. I was just gonna say that he wanted Cassio's position.
Okay, so another reason he's bitter at Othello is not directly for who Othello is exactly, although that may be relevant, but simply that he's jealous, right? Here's the theme of jealousy. Notice Othello jealous and Iago jealous, and it has to do with issues of reputation and recognition and status. And of course, even Cassio has his own weaknesses about his own status. He's concerned with his reputation. He says so. So he's bitter with Othello simply because he chose Cassio rather than Iago, right? Simple as that. Any other reasons that he states or any other reasons that you can surmise about why he may have such contempt for Othello? Okay, good. So Daniel says that doesn't he think that Othello slept with his wife Emilia? So there's this very interesting moment in which Iago says, there are rumors abroad that Othello slept with my wife. And he basically says, I'm not really sure whether they're true or not. They're just rumors, but I'm going to treat them as if they're true. Think about someone who says something like that. I really don't know if they're true, but I'm going to hate this man on the basis of just saying, you know what, I think they're true, even though I don't really know, right? So if that's the case, that Othello slept with his wife, we never get any confirmation of this rumor, let's be clear. And we only get an image of Othello being faithful to his wife. And I think we're left as viewers with this loose end to figure out whether you think he could have slept with Emilia. But we're never presented with any evidence of this other than this rumor. And Iago never mentions this again for the rest of the play. So you really have to question whether it's true. This is the kind of thing Iago does. Any other questions of why Iago feels such contempt? Any other thoughts as to why? Let's ask the obvious question and we'll call it a night. Does he hate him because he's a Moor and because he's not a white European?
Yeah, he's
Yes.
he's racist for sure.
And what leads you to that conclusion? What does he do? What does he say that makes it obvious that that's his motive?
He calls them the Moor.
Okay, sure. So, I mean, there's an interesting problem with his use of that term, which is that it's a term that's going to resonate with other white Europeans in this world, other Venetians, because they're all, you know, they're likely going to demote the status of that person if for no other reason that they're an outsider, and they can be treated, at least in certain moments, right? When they call him Othello, they recognize all his personal excellences and attributes, his status as a general. When they call him a Moor, it's really a very broad generic stereotype where all the specificity of this character is lost, right? So, I mean, it's interesting. Obviously, he exploits the racism that's existing in his society that, you know, really isn't any different than any other society. Ours, or, I mean, we're not talking about some primitive age in which we've transcended. But whether the racial component is the primary component is a question I think we'll have to look at more carefully, or at least how it ranks, because we realize immediately that he's got multiple motivations for having contempt for Othello. And I mean, I think part of the complication of Iago is, why does he have so many motivations? Why does he have so many motives against Othello? I mean, there should be, if he's going to do what he's going to do, you would think there would be one big one that would be the defining thing that motivates him to do the despicable things he does. But the more the play persists, the more it is rather confusing exactly what the big motive is, right? So that's something we'll start looking at next class. So with that, thank you for hanging on here, and going forward, we're gonna keep it on time. And if nobody has any urgent kind of business questions, we'll call it a good night. And thank you for the lovely conversation.
Good night, Professor.
Thank you, Professor.
Take care, Professor.
Thank you, Professor. Have a good night. Thank you, Professor. Have a good night.
Professor, I have a question. for
night.
you. Hello. Can you hear me?
You have a question?
Yeah. So,
One second. Let me turn off the record so we're not recording all the business stuff.
problem.
Um.